My grandmother died and left behind two things: a luxurious apartment in the capital for my brother and a crumbling, vine-choked house in a forgotten village for me. When the lawyer read the will aloud in that dim office, smelling of dust and old paper, I didn't cry. I simply froze. My brother smirked like he'd won some long-planned game. My husband sneered with visible contempt. That's what you get. He spat for being useless. That night, he threw my suitcase into the hallway and slammed the door behind me. No money, no job, just a rusty key and a train ticket to nowhere. I arrived at the village as twilight bled into the hills. The house stood crooked at the edge of an overgrown garden, its shutters flapping like broken wings. I expected rats, rot, maybe ghosts. But when I opened the creaking door, what I found inside made my heart lurch and my knees tremble. My name is Olena, and that was the moment everything changed. I grew up mostly alone but never lonely, not with Grandma Maria. My parents died in a car accident when I was 7, and from that day forward, my grandmother became my whole world. She was a small, sharp-aimed woman with hands always busy, sewing, cooking, scribbling in tiny notebooks. But what I remember most was her warmth, her endless stories, and the way she looked at me like I mattered more than anything in the world. Back then, we lived together in a modest apartment in the city. Every evening, she'd make herbal tea and read aloud from old books, myths, fairy tales, stories from our ancestors. Her voice was soft but firm, the kind that made you believe every word. I'd sit beside her, head on her lap, dreaming of kings and lost cities. It was magic, and I felt safe. When I got older, things changed. I met Igor in university. He was charming, ambitious, and full of big dreams. I was studying literature, he was in business. He talked about the future like it was something he could grab by the throat. I admired that. Grandma wasn't sure about him. She warned me once, "A man who rushes toward power often forgets who waits at home." I brushed it off. Love made me blind. We married young. Grandma cried at the wedding. Not tears of joy, I realize now, but worry. Still, she gave us her blessing, and when we moved into a rented flat, she gave me her collection of old books, a quiet symbol, perhaps, of everything she hoped I'd hold on to. I got a job as a school librarian. It didn't pay much, but I loved it. The quiet, the smell of pages, the small hands of children flipping through picture books. Igor, on the other hand, quickly rose in his company. He worked late, came home angry, talked less and less. I tried to be the good wife, dinner ready, apartment clean, never complaining. Years passed, and I faded. I didn't even notice how much. Every dream I had became a shadow of his ambition. He said my job was cute, but not real work. I laughed it off. He mocked my books, called them dusty old nonsense. I stayed silent, but I never stopped writing. Secretly, in the quiet corners of night, I scribbled fragments of stories Grandma told me, of feelings I couldn't speak aloud. It was the only piece of me that survived. When Grandma got sick, I visited her every weekend. Igor never came. "She's old," he said. "What's the point?" But I sat by her bed, held her hand, and read to her like she once read to me. Even in her final days, her eyes lit up when I opened a book. "Keep reading, Olena," she'd whisper. "Words are how we live forever." She passed away in autumn. The world felt suddenly quieter. I cried in the bathroom where Igor wouldn't see. He didn't even come to the funeral. Too busy, he said. Anton showed up late and left early. I thought that was the end of a chapter. I didn't know it was only the prologue. After the funeral, I returned to our apartment feeling like a ghost. The silence between Igor and me grew thicker. He asked no questions about the burial, never mentioned Grandma again. That night, as I unpacked the small box of her belongings, a scarf she loved, a ring she wore every day, and a tattered journal, I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, not yet, just a hollow space waiting. In the weeks that followed, I reread her journal. It was filled with thoughts, memories, and half-finished letters. She wrote about her fears, her dreams for me, her disappointment and how far I had drifted from myself. There were pages about Anton, too, about how he had always craved wealth, how she tried to reach him but failed. And then, near the end, a line that made my breath catch. Olena may not shine in the city's spotlight, but she carries our flame. That sentence haunted me. Was that why she left me the house? Not as punishment, but as a path back to myself? I started to remember more. Summers in that village when I was small. The orchard, the well, the attic where Grandma once let me play dress up in her mother's old clothes, the hidden drawer where she kept letters from her youth. It all felt like a dream now, but it had been real. So real. I had once been part of something, of roots, of stories, of women who came before me. Somewhere along the way I'd forgotten, but Grandma hadn't. She never forgot. I didn't know it then, but her death would be the beginning of my return, not just to a house, but to a self I thought I'd lost forever. It didn't happen all at once. The shift was gradual, like a slow leak in a tire you don't notice until you're stranded. At first, Igor was just tired, then critical, then cold. He would come home and barely speak. If dinner wasn't hot, he'd sigh dramatically. If I asked how his day was, he'd wave me off with a, "You wouldn't understand." He stopped asking about my job entirely. Once I came home excited because one of my students had won a writing competition. I shared the news over dinner, expecting maybe a smile. Instead, he shrugged. "Do they even give real prizes for that kind of thing?" he said, not even looking up from his phone. When I showed him a short story I had secretly submitted to a magazine, he didn't read it. "You still writing those little fantasies?" he said, chuckling. "Maybe one day you'll get published and make us rich." It was a joke, but it stung. I began to notice other things. The way he praised women at his office, smart, driven, real achievers. The way he introduced me at parties. "This is Olena, she works in a school or something." I always smiled, laughed, played the part. Even my body became a point of critique. "You used to take better care of yourself," he said once. Just saying. Then there was Anton, my brother. Charming, successful Anton. He rarely called, but when he did, it was always about himself. His new car, his business trips, his promotions. At family gatherings, he talked over me. Once, when I brought a homemade cake for our father's birthday, Anton quipped, "Well, at least you're good for something." Nobody laughed, nobody defended me. I laughed too. What else could I do? My opinions didn't matter. My presence barely registered. At dinner tables, at celebrations, I was the one asked to pour tea, to clear dishes, to stay quiet when the serious conversations began. Even Grandma's affection for me was seen as quaint. "She always had a soft spot for you," Anton said once. "Probably because you never gave her any real stress." The implication was clear. I was too harmless to be a disappointment. I began to doubt myself. Maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't enough. Not smart enough, not strong enough, not modern enough. I tried harder. I cooked better meals. I listened more. I offered to help Igor with his projects, even though he never asked. "Stick to your books," he told me once. "Leave the money stuff to real professionals." The loneliness was the worst part. Being alone in a marriage is lonelier than being single. I'd sit on the balcony some nights, listening to the city hum below, wondering how I got here, wondering if this was all I was meant for. Supporting roles in silent rooms. The only person who still saw me was Grandma. She'd call, ask how I was, send little packages, jam, knitted scarves, old photos. One day, she mailed me a book she found in the attic. Inside was a note, "Remember who you are." I kept that book under my pillow. But everything else, the world I'd built, was starting to feel like it belonged to someone else. And the more I tried to hold on to it, the more it slipped through my fingers. There were moments I wanted to scream, but instead I smiled. I perfected the art of invisibility, of making myself small so others could feel big. Even my friends drifted away. When I canceled a lunch to help Igor with a client dinner, no one rescheduled. When I said I was too tired to go out, no one insisted. I remember one evening, Igor came home unusually late. His tie was loosened, and he smelled like perfume that wasn't mine. I didn't ask. I just set his plate on the table and said, "Dinner's warm." He didn't even answer. That night, I sat in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time someone had asked me what I wanted. Not what I could do for them or what I planned to cook or when the rent was due, but what made me happy. I couldn't come up with an answer. That was the scariest part of all. Grandma's voice came back to me then, in that quiet, aching moment. "The world will try to tell you who you are," she once said. "Don't let it decide for you." But the world had already decided, and I had let it. The day we went to the notary's office, I wore my nicest coat and combed my hair 3 times. It was a cold gray morning, and I told myself it would be fine, that maybe, despite everything, Grandma Maria had remembered who I was, what we had shared. Anton was already there, lounging in a leather chair with his legs crossed like he owned the place. He didn't greet me, just smirked and looked at his phone. The office smelled like old paper and varnish. The lawyer, a thin man with hollow eyes, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before reading the will. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but each word landed like a stone in my chest. "To my grandson Anton, I leave the apartment in the capital." Anton's smirk grew into a full grin. He shot me a quick glance, smug and satisfied. "And to my granddaughter Olena, I leave the house in the village of Velichka, along with all its land and belongings." I couldn't breathe. The village house? That forgotten ruin wrapped in ivy and dust? Surely there was some mistake. I hadn't seen it in decades. Anton burst into a laugh. Well, guess she thought you were better suited for the countryside?" The lawyer didn't react. He handed us each a set of papers and a key. I stood up slowly, feeling like my body wasn't mine. Outside, Igor was waiting in the car. When I told him what had happened, his face twisted. "Are you serious?" he barked. "She gave you a shack and your idiot brother gets prime real estate?" I tried to explain, tried to say maybe the house had sentimental value, that maybe it meant something more, but he wasn't listening. "For once, could you do something right just once?" he snapped. "You're a disappointment, always have been." See my throat close. "Please, Igor, I didn't choose this." "No, but you're the reason it happened." Pathetic. When we got home, he didn't speak to me. That night, after dinner, he stood in the doorway of our bedroom, arms crossed. "Pack your things. I'm done. Go live in your shack. Maybe you'll finally be useful for something." I stared at him. "You're kicking me out?" He didn't blink. "You've contributed nothing. I've carried you long enough." I didn't cry. I couldn't. I packed in silence, my hands numb, my heart hollow. I took the suitcase, the key, and the papers, left the apartment we once called home. No plan, no money, just a destination. The village. I took the overnight train. It rattled and wheezed through towns I didn't know. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching black fields and blinking lights, wondering if I was going somewhere or simply running away. Belichka greeted me with fog and silence. The road was cracked, the air damp. I dragged my suitcase up the hill where the house stood like a memory, tilted, peeling, wrapped in vines. I expected the worst, rot, mold, silence, but when I opened the door, the air smelled of old wood and dried lavender. The furniture was dusted, the floor clean. It was like someone had been caring for it. There was a note on the kitchen table in Grandma's handwriting, "Welcome home, my Olena." That's when I cried. Ugly, heaving sobs that bent me in half. She knew, she had always known, and this wasn't a punishment. It was a beginning. That first night in the house, I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with a blanket over my shoulders, a cup of stale tea in my hands, and Grandma's note beside me. I read it over and over, just 4 words, but they held me like arms I hadn't felt in months. I explored the house slowly, each creaking floorboard echoing under my feet. It wasn't as broken as I feared. The roof held, the walls stood strong. The windows let in pale moonlight that painted the rooms in silver. On one shelf, I found a candle in a ceramic holder, one I remembered from my childhood. I lit it, and the flicker made shadows dance on the walls like spirits. In the corner of the bedroom was a trunk. Inside were folded quilts, a few old dresses, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. The top letter had my name on it. I didn't open it. Not yet. I wasn't ready. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and whispered to the darkness, "Why, Grandma? Why this way?" There was no answer. Only the steady beat of wind against the windows and the faint scent of thyme from a nearby drawer. I stayed there for hours, not quite awake, not quite dreaming, until morning painted the horizon with hesitant light. The next day, I walked through the village. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, emptier. Some houses were boarded up, others had smoking chimneys. A few old women eyed me from behind curtains. I nodded at them, unsure if they recognized me. At the general store, I bought bread and matches. The cashier, a woman in her 60s, narrowed her eyes. "You're Maria's granddaughter?" "Yes," I replied, surprised. "She always talked about you," she said, then handed me a jar of honey from under the counter. "Welcome back." I stepped outside, and for the first time in months, I felt a sliver of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Back at the house, I opened the letter. Grandma's handwriting filled the page. Looping, neat, full of pauses. She wrote of how much she loved me, how she had known my pain even when I didn't share it, how she'd chosen to leave me the house, not because it was worthless, but because it was full of everything that truly mattered. "This place," she wrote, "is more than walls. It's a story, and stories, my dear Olena, are what we're made of." Pressed the letter to my chest and cried again, but this time the tears didn't burn, they healed. That was the moment I stopped running. From the past, from myself. I was no longer the woman who had been kicked out, humiliated, discarded. I was Maria's granddaughter, keeper of stories, guardian of a legacy. And for the first time in years, I knew exactly who I was. The days that followed felt like a blur. Quiet, heavy, strange. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, only that I had nowhere else to go. I moved through the house like a ghost, cleaning rooms one by one, not because they were dirty, but because I needed something, anything, to keep my hands busy and my mind from unraveling. I woke up early, made tea, and stared out the window. There wasn't much to see. Bare trees, quiet roads, clouds that hung low like wool. I didn't hear from Anton. I didn't hear from Igor. The silence stretched long and unkind. Some nights I sat by the fireplace, wrapped in Grandma's old shawl, and stared into the flames, wondering how my life had come to this. I had no job, no money, no friends nearby, no plan, just an old house and a stack of fading letters that smelled like lavender and thyme. I read them slowly, one at a time. Grandma had written them across the last decade of her life. Some were notes to herself, others were addressed to me but never sent. In one, she wrote, "If you are reading this, you've probably lost something you thought would last forever. I hope you know that grief is not the end, just the shape love takes when it's missing." I wept. Not loud or dramatic, just soft, slow tears that slid down without warning. I cried for her, for myself, for all the years I had spent shrinking to fit someone else's life. There were moments I wanted to leave, to abandon the house and hitch a ride back to the city. But where would I go? Back to what? No one was waiting. I tried writing again. At first, it was just a line, then a paragraph, then pages. I filled an old journal with memories of Grandma, of childhood, of pain I hadn't known how to name before. Writing became my only prayer, my only way to breathe. But it wasn't enough. The darkness still came in waves. Days when I didn't get out of bed, when the silence of the house felt suffocating, when I questioned every decision that had led me here. One morning, I walked into the woods behind the house, thinking maybe the fresh air would help. I wandered without direction, my boots sinking into wet leaves until I found the old well, where Grandma and I used to pick mint. It was crumbling now, but still there. I sat on its edge and stared into the dark water. Thought about letting go, just disappearing. But then I remembered her voice. You are more than what they made you feel. I closed my eyes and whispered the words aloud. More than what they made me feel. I didn't stand up right away, but I didn't jump either. That was something. When I returned home, I lit a candle and placed it beside Grandma's photo. Her eyes, even in that frozen image, looked full of knowing. The next day, I went to the attic. I hadn't been there since my arrival. Dust coated everything, but in one corner, I found a wooden crate. Inside were old photographs, some of people I didn't recognize, and a leather-bound book with a lock. The key, I later realized, was in the drawer of Grandma's sewing table. When I opened the book, I found notes, careful, detailed notes about each book in the house library. Provenance, historical significance, even price estimates. My heart pounded. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a treasure trove. And suddenly I had a purpose. I stayed up late that night reading every page of that leather-bound ledger. Grandma had known the worth of these books. Not just monetary, but cultural, historical, spiritual. She had spent decades cataloging them, preserving their stories, and now they were in my hands. In the back pocket of the book, I found a folded envelope, addressed simply, "To Olena, when she's ready." I opened it with trembling fingers. "My dearest girl," it began, "if you're holding this, then life has brought you to a place where you need to remember who you are. This house is not just old walls. It is our family's spine. And you, Olena, you are its beating heart." I clutched the letter to my chest and sobbed. But they were no longer just tears of grief. They were something else too. Recognition. Truth. The next morning, I went to the village square and asked the shopkeeper if she knew anyone who worked with antiques. She gave me a name. That afternoon, I wrote an email. It was shaky, unsure, but it was a step. That evening, I wrote in my journal, "Maybe I am not lost. Maybe I've just been waiting to be found." And for the first time in a long while, I believed it. Everything shifted after that letter. With new resolve, I began to organize the house, not as a place to hide, but as a place to live. I turned the smallest room into a writing nook, stacking Grandma's ledgers beside me. I made lists of the books in the hidden library and labeled them with sticky notes and numbers. Each title was like opening a window into another life, another time. I reached out again to the antique expert the shopkeeper recommended. His name was Corell, a quiet man in his 40s with a love for old things. He arrived 2 weeks later with a notebook and gentle curiosity. As we explored the shelves together, his eyes widened. "These are extraordinary," he said, handling a centuries-old Latin folio like it was a newborn. "Some of these editions are... I haven't seen anything like this outside National Archives." I nodded, but inside I was burning with pride. And something else. Purpose. We spent days cataloging everything. Karel brought in a colleague, a young woman named Mira, who specialized in Slavic manuscripts. She and I bonded over tea and stories. For the first time in years, I felt surrounded by people who listened when I spoke and cared what I had to say. Inspired, I began writing in earnest, not just journals, but a book, a memoir of sorts. I called it The House in Velichka. I wrote about my childhood, my grandmother's stories, the betrayal I had endured, the healing I had found among old pages and forgotten letters. I poured myself into every sentence. Meanwhile, word of the library spread quietly. A small cultural foundation reached out asking if I would consider hosting an exhibition. I agreed, nervous but excited. With the help of the village council, we cleaned the front parlor and transformed it into a miniature gallery. Old books in glass cases, photos of Grandma, letters framed and lit by soft lamps. The exhibition opening was modest but moving. People came, locals, scholars, even journalists. One elderly man wept in front of a letter written by his own grandfather found in the collection. "I thought this was lost forever," he whispered. I knew then we were doing something important. A few weeks later, a publisher contacted me. Mira had mentioned my manuscript to a friend. They wanted to read it. 2 months later, they offered me a book deal. When the book was published, it wasn't a bestseller, but it was read, reviewed, passed around. I received letters, so many letters, from women like me who had been silenced, forgotten, left behind. "You reminded me I have a voice," one wrote. "You gave me courage," said another. I framed those letters and hung them near my writing desk. And slowly, the fear that had ruled me for years began to loosen its grip. I planted herbs in Grandma's old pots. I repainted the shutters a soft blue. I invited local children to come and hear stories on Saturdays. We sat on the steps in the afternoon sun, laughing, imagining. I was no longer just surviving, I was living, creating, belonging. Velichka was no longer a refuge. It was home. One morning, as I sat writing by the window, I received a message from a university in Lviv. They were hosting a symposium on memory and cultural preservation, and they wanted me to speak. Almost said no, the old fear crept in. What could I possibly offer? But I remembered Grandma's letter, "You are the heart." So I said, yes. Standing at that podium months later, reading aloud an excerpt from my book, I saw faces move to tears. When I finished, they stood and clapped. Not for a famous writer, but for a woman who had once thought she was nothing, and now knew she was everything she needed to be. Afterward, I returned to Velichka, exhausted but glowing. I walked into the house, lit a candle, and sat beneath Grandma's photo. "We did it," I whispered. And I swear, for just a moment, the shadows danced with joy. What had started as escape had become a revolution of the soul. And I wasn't done yet. Later that week, I received another letter, this time from a museum in Kiev. They had heard about the library and wanted to collaborate on preserving the collection. They even proposed a grant to support renovations for long-term exhibitions. It hit me then. What Grandma had given me wasn't just a place or even a purpose. It was a legacy, a bridge between generations, a chance to make sure our stories would never be buried again. I said yes. A month after the book launch, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I let it ring twice before answering. "Elena?" The voice was hesitant, familiar. "It was Anton." "I heard about your book," he began, "and the exhibition. Looks like things are going well for you." I didn't say anything. He chuckled awkwardly. "Listen, I was thinking maybe we could talk, maybe about swapping the inheritance. I mean, you've got your library and, well, I'm more of a city guy, you know? You give me the house and I'll transfer the apartment to your name. It's a fair trade." I stared at the phone, stunned. After all this time, now he saw value in what I had inherited. But I had changed. And my silence wasn't weakness anymore, it was clarity. "No, Anton," I said, "it's not for sale and it's not for trade." He tried to sound casual. "Come on, Elena, it's just a house." "No," I said, "it's my grandmother's soul. It's history. And it's mine." He paused. "You'll regret this." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I already don't." I hung up. That same week, I was invited to speak on a national television segment about cultural preservation. I wore a soft blue dress, the color of Grandma's shutters, and told our story. About the forgotten house, the letters, the books, the legacy. The host asked me, "Did you ever expect to be here?" And I said, "No, but maybe that's the point. We often find our voice in places we were told to leave behind." The interview went viral. Publishers reached out. One asked if I would consider turning the book into a series, a deeper dive into the women in my family line. Another invited me to co-host a podcast about untold histories. I said yes to both. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't gloat, but I did stop hiding. I redesigned the gallery room in the house to include a corner for women's voices, letters, books, essays written by women of the village over generations. I called it the Whispering Shelf. Visitors came from cities and towns, some bringing old journals, others just to listen. One day, as I finished a workshop for teenage girls in the village, a woman in a sharp blazer approached me. She introduced herself as a cultural liaison for the Ministry of Education. "We want to feature your home library and life story as part of a national heritage project," she said. "It's powerful, it's necessary." I nodded, almost numb with joy. "Yes," I whispered. Later that night, I made myself tea and sat by the fire. I opened my second manuscript, half written, half raw. I was no longer writing for validation, I was writing for truth. For every woman who had ever been told she was small, who was handed dust and told it was ash, when it was, in fact, gold. I wasn't just rebuilding a house, I was rewriting a history. And I was only getting started. The more I embraced my story, the more it spread. I was invited to lecture at international conferences, Prague, Warsaw, Vienna. I stood on grand stages and spoke about a village girl who found her power in pages, about a house that held more strength than a city apartment ever could. Each time I spoke, I mentioned Grandma Maria. Each time I read a passage from one of her letters. I was not alone on those stages. She was with me in every word. I used part of my earnings from the book to set up a scholarship for girls from rural areas who wanted to study literature or archival studies. I named it after Grandma. The first recipient wrote to me, "I never thought someone like me could belong in a university. Your story changed that." One evening, I received a message from Igor. Just a line, "I saw you on TV." I didn't reply. Weeks later, he showed up unannounced at the gate of the house in Velichka. He looked smaller somehow, worn. He handed me a bouquet of flowers. "Roses, our old favorite." "I was wrong," he said, "about everything." I looked at him. The man who had once made me feel like nothing now stood before me, unsure and silent. "I don't hate you," I said quietly, "but I no longer need you." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I just wanted you to know." Then he turned and left. I stood there a moment longer, then went inside. I placed the roses in a jar, not as forgiveness, but as closure. That night, I lit a candle, opened a fresh page, and wrote, "This is not revenge, this is reclamation." And it was. A month later, I hosted the first memory festival in Velichka, a weekend where villagers shared old stories, cooked traditional dishes, and celebrated forgotten crafts. The house overflowed with laughter, music, life. Reporters came, children danced in the yard, elders cried happy tears. I stood on the porch, looking out over everything, and realized I hadn't just rebuilt a home, I had rebuilt a legacy. It was a rainy Sunday when Anton showed up again. I saw his car through the window, sleek black and no longer new. He stepped out slowly, holding a plastic folder close to his chest, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous stiffness. I didn't open the door right away. I watched him stand there in the rain for a few minutes. Then I stepped outside. "Elena," he said, "can we talk?" I nodded but didn't smile. He followed me into the front parlor where the fireplace was still warm from the morning. I made tea, not out of hospitality but formality. He looked around as if seeing the house for the first time, not as ruins, but as something alive. "I made a mistake," he began. "I thought this place was worthless. I thought you weren't meant for anything important." I said nothing. He handed me the folder. Inside were legal papers. His business had collapsed. Debts, lawsuits, he was trying to liquidate assets, but the apartment, his prize, had been mortgaged too far to save. "I was wondering," he said, avoiding my eyes, "if there's any chance you could help. Just a loan, just to keep things afloat." I closed the folder gently. "I'm sorry, Anton," I said, "but I can't help you." He looked up, shocked. "Can't or won't?" I met his gaze. "Both." He sat back in his chair like I'd struck him. "So this is payback?" "No," I said quietly. "This is a boundary. He left without finishing his tea. Later that month, I heard from mutual contacts that Igor had lost his job. The firm downsized and replaced him with someone younger. He tried starting a consultancy, but without backing, it fizzled out. He posted online about new beginnings and resilience, but there was something hollow in his eyes. One day, a journalist writing a piece on my project reached out. She mentioned she'd interviewed Igor for context. He told me, she said, that he always believed in you. I smiled. Then I suppose his memory is more generous than his behavior ever was. I wasn't cruel. I didn't expose them. I didn't write their names into my books, but I didn't erase the truth either, because the truth mattered now, and so did I. Months passed, and the contrast between our lives became undeniable. While I traveled, taught, and wrote, Anton struggled to maintain relevance. Invitations dried up, investors backed away. His name, once spoken with admiration, was now followed by quiet pity. Igor, meanwhile, moved to a smaller town. I learned through a friend that he had remarried, but it didn't last. He left behind a trail of burned bridges and short-lived ventures. He reached out once through a mutual friend, asking if I might be open to reconnecting. I declined. What surprised me was how little anger I felt. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need revenge. I had something better, peace. During one autumn event at the library, a young girl approached me after my reading. She held a dog-eared copy of my book, eyes wide. "I want to be like you," she whispered. "I want to tell stories too." I knelt beside her and smiled. "Then start now. Start with your own." That was the true return, not fame, not fortune, but the ripple effect of healing, of standing tall so others could see the path. Anton and Igor had taken so much, but I had found something they never could. Myself, I didn't celebrate their downfall, but I honored my rise. Every setback they once handed me had become a stepping stone. Every silence I endured had taught me to hear myself more clearly. And in that clarity, I built a life no one could take away. The first winter in Velechka was quiet and long. Snow wrapped the village in silence, but inside the house, life thrived. Fires crackled, pages turned, laughter echoed during weekend readings with children and late-night conversations with visiting scholars. I spent the season finishing my second book, a deeper exploration of my family's women, the matriarchs who held generations together with thread, stories, and memory. It was my love letter to them, and to Grandma Maria most of all. When spring came, I planted wildflowers along the garden path. Bees returned. So did people. Visitors came not just for the books, but for something else. Something they couldn't quite name. A feeling, a memory, a spark. In every corner of the house, I'd left stories waiting to be found. One afternoon, as I dusted the shelves, I found a postcard wedged between two books. It was old, the ink faded. On it, Grandma had written just one line: "May you always come home to yourself." I stood still, the words sinking deep. That was what this journey had been. A return, not just to a village or a house, but to myself. To the version of me that once sat on Grandma's lap, dreaming. To the woman who believed in the power of words. To the girl who never truly disappeared, only waited to be remembered. The house in Velechka was no longer just my inheritance. It was my choice, my declaration. I had been underestimated, forgotten, pushed aside. But now I was seen. I was heard. And more importantly, I saw myself. Every time I stepped into the library, I felt it. The quiet power of stories, of legacy, of resilience. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need applause. I had purpose. That was the greatest gift my grandmother ever gave me. And now I would spend my life passing it on. That summer, I launched a mentorship program for young women writers. We met every month at the house, sharing ideas, reading drafts aloud, encouraging one another. Some of the girls came from places where no one had ever asked what they wanted to say. Here, they were heard. At the first gathering, I read them a quote from one of Grandma's journals. A story, like a seed, must be planted in love and tended with care. Only then will it bloom strong enough to outlive us. We painted that line above the mantle. I sometimes imagined what Grandma would say if she saw all of this. Children in her kitchen, scholars in her garden, books once buried, now breathing again. I think she'd smile, shake her head softly, and say, "Told you you'd find your way." She always did believe in me, before anyone else, even when I didn't. Now, standing at the window and watching the lilacs sway in the breeze, I understood. The pain, the betrayal, the solitude, they weren't my end. They were the crucible that forged me into who I was meant to be. We can lose everything and still rise. We can be broken and still become whole. Because healing isn't forgetting, it's remembering who we are and choosing again and again to live by that truth. Years from now, when people walk through these rooms, I hope they'll feel not just the history, but the heart, the courage it takes to reclaim your voice, the strength in softness, the power in persistence. And maybe, just maybe, they'll be inspired to return to themselves too. Because that's what this house taught me. The greatest story you'll ever write is the one where you become who you truly are.